These lands belong to the Yagarabal, Yagara, Jagera, Turrbal, Yugambeh and Kombumerri peoples. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all of our Indigenous colleagues and their communities. Just to warn everyone, we are recording the session and we'll be placing the recording on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, Chris, for allowing that. Now, just for some background, it was my great honour to represent GIER at a national roundtable convened by AARE and the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia on August the 5th this year. And that was to agree on directions for educational research in Australia over the next 10 years. The day-long session was chaired by Dr. Chris Hatherly, the CEO of the Academy, supported by Julie McLeod of AARE and Jill Blackmore. We decided to invite Chris to speak with us about the priorities and directions, their development, their focus and next steps, because this work is incredibly important for education research at all levels, and that of course includes for the members of GIER. I'd like to hand over now to Chris. Chris, if you could perhaps just begin by letting us know a bit about the role of the Academy and then take us through those priorities and directions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thanks for the invitation and the opportunity. It's great to be here and to have an opportunity to share a little bit of the context, some of the information about what was agreed at that roundtable and some ideas on where we're going with it next as well for education research in Australia. Before I do, I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people in Canberra. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Interestingly, just on the weekend, I managed to drag my kids age 8 and 10 out on a bushwalk into our local national park, Tidbinbilla National Park, for those who are familiar with Canberra and surrounds. And as we were going, we were kind of researching a little bit about the Aboriginal history of the region, and it turns out Tidbinbilla comes from a Ngunnawal word, Jedbinbilla, which is where boys become men, and it was a traditional site where boys would go for a kind of an initiation into manhood. And my 10-year-old son was quite taken with that concept. It was an easy 5-kilometre bushwalk out and back along a trail, but he kind of came back feeling he was a bit more manly somehow. Not sure how much that'll stick, but it was a good experience and a good kind of cultural learning as well about our region. So I'm CEO of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. The Academy of Social Sciences, it's one of 5 learned academies in the country. We have academies covering science, the Australian Academy of Science, there's the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, the Australian Academy of Humanities, and there's a newish Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences as well. So 5 learned academies, each of which elect members. So usually leading scholars in their disciplines, but in some cases business and industry leaders or very senior public servants or members of the judiciary, for instance, and nominated by existing members, by their peers. And then there's a very robust election process, which is the way in which people are inducted as fellows of these academies. And together across the 5 academies, there's about 3,200 elected fellows. And within our Academy of the Social Sciences, there's 750 in total. The disciplines we cover, education is one of the key ones. It was one of the first ones, in fact. Education research, our academy back in the post-war period was in fact started in a slightly different guise than it is today, but started by Keith Cunningham, who I believe was the inaugural director of ACER as well. So we've got education research as at our roots. We span other disciplines: sociology, anthropology, history, philosophy, economics, accounting, management, psychology, that's my own discipline, and a range of others as well, but generally all of the social sciences with some overlap into other kind of academy spheres as well. As I said, we've been around for quite some time as an academy for just over 50 years now, and that's on par with the other academies. And we're basically independent, not-for-profit organisation. which is largely funded by government still. We have a kind of an untied block grant as part of the Higher Education Support Act. It's quite a privileged position to be in. I think once upon a time there were thousands of not-for-profits funded in this way, but there's probably only a handful left in the country now. And that funding is really there to allow the academies to champion and support their disciplines in the ways they see fit. That's through electing members. So we've got early career awards, we've got grants programs. We provide expert advice to governments on a whole range of social and research policy matters. We try and be pragmatic in that, but sometimes we need to jump up and down and shake our fists, particularly when it comes to things like research funding or infrastructure support. We engage in international collaboration, so we're an auspicing member of, for Australia, of the International Science Council and a number of other international scientific unions. We have bilateral agreements and MOUs with a number of different academies in different countries. Some of them include bilateral funding programs. And we also support and host an organisation called the Association of Asian Social Science Research Councils. It's a bit of a mouthful. We call it ASREC for short. But that's academies and funding councils across the Asia-Pacific region who have got a focus on social sciences, either exclusively or as part of a broader remit. And we come together with that group and identify priorities, opportunities for collaboration. And in recent times, we've been managing much larger grants programs as well, which is allocating funding for priority areas in the Asia Pacific, some of which involve Australian researchers, but many of which are kind of separate. And then finally, the academies all have different programs aimed at engaging with the public. So lectures, presentations, outreach programs. Our academy coordinates a National Social Sciences Week every September. So hopefully some people would have seen and maybe had an opportunity to participate in this last month. It's relatively new. It was created as an answer to National Sciences Week, and we're now in our 7th year, but very much increasing in impact and reach over time. And this year there was around 100 events in person and virtual across Australia during the course of that week of 7th to 14th of September or thereabouts. And for our academy too, very recently, I'll come back to this at the end of my talk, but we've started moving into the area of social science curriculum resources for schools. And we've done this on the basis of some work we did a number of years back, which was a State of the Social Sciences report. And we looked both at the university sector, but also more broadly from early childhood education and schooling through vocational education, Indigenous Australia, professional life as well. Really trying to get a sense from stakeholders in those areas of how social science sat, how it was funded, how it was structured, how it was perceived, and where the opportunities and challenges were. And then with respect to schools, one of the things we heard very clearly from both teachers and teachers associations and in some cases principals associations was that there was a real urgent need for high quality, expert assured resources for social science subject areas. Loads of things out there for STEM, which is understandable and necessary, but very, very little when it came to things like civics education or geography perhaps and history perhaps better serviced than others, but business and economics education, communications education, some of the cross-curriculum kind of modalities like debating, for instance. There was really a lack of resources there for teachers, both in and out of field. And what we heard there was that it would be valuable for the academy to kind of step into that space. The other thing we heard, which we haven't yet started acting on as much as we wanted, is the need for career and study resources in the social science disciplines as well for late stage high school students and their parents and teachers. Things that could be used by teachers or career counsellors or by parents in discussions with their children about why they should consider studying social sciences, either generally through an arts degree or specifically through the many other courses. We were doing this at the time of the Job Ready Graduates bill going through Parliament. I'm sure people are still scarred by that and the narrative that went with it. We had our federal education minister standing up and saying, parents, if you let your kids study an arts degree, they're basically wasting their life. So it was a pretty damaging time for the disciplines and the kind of feedback we received there was that we need things in the social sciences which demonstrate to students, to parents, to teachers why there is value in pursuing social science as a study and career pathway. So that's a kind of an overview, a snapshot of what our academy does and what we do. Our head office is based in Canberra, but we have people working in Canberra and around the country. We're a small team. We're only about 10 FTE. As I said, funded largely by government, but also through philanthropic grants, commissioned work, contracts for various bits and pieces, and membership fees. But within that kind of smallish team, we cover a lot under the direction of a board, which is drawn from our elected fellowship. I'm going to try and share a presentation. Is there any questions or anything, Steve, you wanted me to cover before I kind of get into?
No, that's all right, Chris. If we go straight to the presentation now, I'm sure people will have plenty of questions that span the various parts of your talk today.
Okay.
And I'll also keep track of them. If any come in through the chat while you're talking, we'll
Sure.
have a pile at the end.
Okay. Is that visible?
Yes.
Hopefully I've made it the right size as well. Okay, good. So challenges and opportunities for Australian educational research. Now, I've as I said, I'm joining from Ngunnawal land, but just before I kicked off, I wanted to share for information a new funding program that's being managed by our academy. This is the Wilhelm, Martha and Otto Reschnitz Memorial Fund, and it was established just a couple of years ago through a bequest from the estate of Reverend Wilhelm Reschnitz, who was it's a long and interesting story. He was a German Jew who was deported to Australia from England during World War II, and he ended up living and working in the Torres Straits as a minister for the Church of England, but also as an educator for almost 3 decades between the 50s and the 80s. And we've got this bequest, which we're managing in his memory, which is there to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars in the social sciences. And we do this, there's a few different components, but the main one is a grants program, grants of up to $20,000 for early career social science researchers, any discipline. We've had 2 rounds so far and given out 7 grants. And 2 of those grants, just in the first couple of rounds, have been to Aboriginal researchers working in or in relation to educational research. We had Associate Professor Jacob Pren from the University of Tasmania. He was funded last year for a project on supporting Indigenous youth in their cultural identity at school. And this year, just a couple of months ago, we announced our new funding program, and one of the recipients this time from the University of Western Australia. I just, sorry, pulling up the title of her project. This is Dr. Bep Uink, and her, I want to get the right title because it's interesting and probably relevant to the discussion here too. Bear with me for a second, sorry. Understanding racism literacy and anti-racism initiatives in Western Australian high schools. So outstanding Aboriginal scholars. I'm not sure to the extent they're engaged in the educational research community, but really the reason I wanted to kind of highlight it here is because we are looking for applications. So within your own networks and both the Institute, but also within other societies and professional associations, we'll open this grant funding round again in February next year, and we'd be grateful for your assistance in sharing this as broadly as possible, because we want to get do as much as we can to support our emerging Indigenous scholars. So the background, as Steve said, we convened a roundtable on the 5th of August at Deakin Downtown in Melbourne. It was convened by the Academy and the Australian Association for Research in Education. There were about 30 individuals at the table. So the program was basically developed by a working group, and that group was convened by Julie McLeod and Jill Blackmore. There was an invitation list of about 45 people and institutions. Not everyone could attend, but we had about 30 people in the room covering research institutes. I mean, Steve was there, as he said, so institutes like yours, other kind of major centres for educational research in Australia. We had all of the relevant associations involved, and we also had some agencies and kind of not-for-profit organisations. So ASA was there, ERA was there, Early Childhood Australia, the National Education Union. So it was kind of intended to be relatively broad in its coverage, but limited to the sector. So we really didn't want to have kind of the policy departments there. We wanted to be able to kind of come together and discuss these issues and priorities, but without having kind of the policymakers in the room. We wanted to be able to kind of work out the issues among ourselves before we started connecting with government, either pursuing or pushing for changes. I guess the reason for this was really focused on the question of how to improve visibility and impact of education research in Australia. Now, this is just a little anecdote. This is a factoid I came across just last week. This is from a new report which was released last month. It's an international report, a global evidence report, a blueprint for better international collaboration on evidence. It was a collaboration between 4 countries, Australia, New Zealand, the US and the UK. And it was chaired by Australia's own chief statistician, David Gruen. David's also a member of the Academy of the Social Sciences. And just working through this, one of the things that we picked out is this little kind of piece of nugget of information here. So there are major policy areas where relatively little is spent on R&D in comparison to the size of the policy or the program spend. So in most countries, I haven't verified this for Australia, but it said on average, countries spend about half as much on education as a kind of a national program area than they do on health and medical services. So healthcare system, medicines, pharmaceutical benefits, hospital care, primary care, etc. And typically that education expenditure is about 10 to 15% of total government expenditure. And this is the interesting and the concerning, but also perhaps the compelling bit. The ratio of percentage expenditure on R&D and health compared with education is 46 times more spent on health and medical research than on education research in the US, 18 times more in the UK, and 142 times more spent on health and medical research in Australia than on education research. And if you kind of work that back to the ratios, if we assume that the program expenditure on education is about half that on health, it basically means that for every dollar that governments are spending on healthcare, on the services and the programs being rolled out, they are co-investing 70 times more in health and medical research than they are for educational research for every dollar spent on education delivery and programs. And that's kind of shocking, particularly when you look at some of those other comparisons, how much worse we are compared to the UK or the US. And for a system and a country that proclaims its interest in evidence-based policy and evidence-based services, the fact that the investment in that evidence is so dismal and so pitiful is cause for concern. And this is kind of, I came across this subsequent to the roundtable, but there was a lot of discussion during the conversation in Melbourne about this kind of the relatively low levels of funding and the low levels of attention given to research experts in the policymaking processes. I think this PowerPoint will probably be shared, and there's a link there to that Blueprint for International Collaboration Evidence report if anyone's interested. So, as we said, we got together in Melbourne. There was about 30 people in the room, and we had a kind of a general discussion around what some of the issues were, with a focus kind of trying to come up with priorities. So what actually needed to change, and the priorities we developed were kind of grouped into 3 themes. The first, justice, equity, and excellence for all. So we had a few things under this. Firstly, the need for more coordinated, cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary research to understand challenges and solutions. You know, we had a group of probably 60% researchers in the room, so it's unsurprising that people were calling for more research to understand the challenges as one of the top priorities. It's not necessarily the way we'd we'd order things when we're going to government to ask, but this definitely came out as one of the key priorities in the room. We had a couple of Indigenous colleagues in the room with us, 3 or 4 in fact, and there was some really passionate and compelling presentations there, and we kind of settled as a group on the idea of there being opportunities to learn from Indigenous approaches to relationality of and within country in a way which could enhance education systems. And then thirdly, there was, I think this is relatively new, but the idea of a need to advance educational self-determination and sovereignty for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There are quite strong self-determination and sovereignty, strong and well-developed movements with respect to Indigenous data. There's a growing kind of understanding and body of work and effort being put into self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous knowledge and the integration into broader systems. But as far as I was aware, certainly, I'm not sure if others in the room had kind of been discussing this before, but the idea of a focus on advancing educational self-determination and sovereignty for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people seemed both inherently necessary and intuitive, but also quite compelling in terms of, you know, what we could do and how we could work with some of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues to kind of set the foundations for that agenda if it's of interest to our colleagues. Priority 2, skilled and resilient workforce. And I should say too that the scope of this discussion was on education across the lifespan. So from early childhood, as I said, we had ECA there in the room, the CEO and their policy director. So from early childhood through schooling, through vocational and tertiary education, and into lifelong adult learning as well. So, you know, educational research writ broad, and the ways in which, you know, the research component can help to inform and build and develop that the workforce, the people who are actually delivering that education across the lifespan. So the priorities, need for research, again, to better understand the configuration, design and organisation of educators' work. The need for shared understandings of professional standards and ethics and the effects of changes to credentials. There was a lot of discussion about inconsistency between states and territories, but also rapid and sometimes arbitrary changes in standards and credentials and the kind of detrimental impact that had. The need for evaluation of innovative models of initial teacher education. Need for better approaches to valuing current educators. So particularly all of as you will all know better than me, the kind of very high rates of attrition at the moment from our current educators from the workforce, the burnout, the stress. You know, what can we do? What can research tell us about better approaches to valuing and retaining that workforce, potentially to bringing back people who have exited the workforce, either through resignation or retirement or career change. So the opportunities for former educators and skilled migration to address some of those workforce shortages, and then better understanding of the impacts of AI technologies and digital transformation across the spectrum of education. And then the third one, this is often in these kinds of discussions, but really talking about the need for world-class connected research capability. And linking that back to those figures I was showing before, you know, it's hard to imagine that Australia could have a world-class connected education research capability if we're investing in it so dismally in comparison to our other research areas. But this was the consensus that we need a strong and connected pipeline of research and scholarly excellence built on really high-quality research training, increased support for education and related social science research, so the capacity building, scholarships, postdoctoral fellowships, special research initiatives, etc., targeted projects, national priorities, and large connected centres of excellence. Frameworks to enable better access and connections across data sets. So the data infrastructure piece came up a bit, and the fact that school data, but also other educational systems, is held by states, and it's very hard to gain access to and link some of that data nationally. And then, again, harmonised processes for institutional and individual participation in research. And again, that's probably an area that the health sciences are doing in some ways better than the educational research sector, as I understand it, at least.
Chris, can I just interrupt?
Please do.
At least on my screen. Oh, thank you. The third priority wasn't coming up, but thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay, do let me know. I don't think I touched anything, but hopefully maybe I had the mouse in the wrong spot or something. Maybe perhaps I'll just pause there though. We do have a bit of time. I'm going to talk about what we concluded and where we're going in a minute, but be interested in people's views and reflections on those kind of three high-level priorities. Do they resonate? Are they the right kind of focus areas?
Yes, well, thanks, Chris. Certainly the first priority resonates strongly with the vision that we have in our institute, that interest in justice, equity, and excellence. I think that it was good that you pointed out the kind of dialogue in the room on the day, that there was some very strong, compelling representations from Indigenous roundtable members. I think too, the second and third priorities resonate with our work, but certainly the first does. I wonder, do any of the folks online have any questions or observations at this stage? Kelsey, anything in the chat as yet?
Nothing in the chat as yet. I'm keeping my eye on it, but there's nothing that's come up.
Right.
Okay, thanks. Let's continue, Chris.
All right. I'll just share again. Share. So, what did we decide to do? It's relatively easy to get a group of people together to discuss and talk and admire the problems, as a turn of phrase I heard just recently, and talk about the impact of those problems and the challenges that are being faced. But what do we actually do about it? So the second half, or the last third perhaps of the day in Melbourne, was focused on coming to some kind of agreement about where do we go as a sector, how can we work together to kind of get some of these priorities onto the national policy agenda, state and territory, but also federal, and how can we work together to try and increase the visibility and the impact of educational research, and also to increase the funding and kind of structural support that is available to educational research within the country. And the way we decided to proceed is to work together as a sector to develop something called a decadal plan, which is basically a long-term, or perhaps a medium-term strategic roadmap for the sector, which maps out where the priorities are, but also really makes a compelling case about what the benefit of those priorities will be if they're properly addressed by the sector itself, but also by governments. There's a long history of research disciplines coming together to develop decadal plans. They've primarily been in the STEM space. There's some here on the screen, and in Australia there's been things like a decadal plan for geography, a decadal plan for Australians in space, a decadal plan for taxonomy and biosystematics, discovering biodiversity. And very recently, just this year, one launched by the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. So this was our decadal plan for social science research infrastructure, 2024 to 2033. Similarly, there's examples of these in other countries. In the US, there's one there on astronomy and astrophysics, and a decadal survey of the social and behavioural sciences, which was a slightly different approach, but it kind of had the same key messages of recommending focus areas over the next decade. The kind of genesis of this approach in Australia was the astronomy community, and there's a very famous and often told story about the astronomy community getting together about 25 years ago. They basically came together as a group, all of the competing research groups and labs who, as is the nature of things in Australia, are primarily competitors, but do come together at conferences and share insights, etc. And the story goes that they decided they needed to do something to increase the profile and investment in astronomy research. So they got together, they locked themselves in a room, they had it out over a couple of days. Then when they were ready, they kind of cleaned the blood off the floor, they opened the door, they put away the knives, and they went out to the broader kind of policy-making community and the general public with this united vision and plan for the development of Australian astronomy over the next decade. They put that together in a decadal plan and launched it the following year at the time that the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy, NCRIS, was being established. So this is partly luck, partly design, but by being in the right place at the right time with the right kind of message and the right set of priorities, which were more or less investment ready, the astronomy community was able to get federal government funding for the establishment of Astronomy Australia, which was it's an NCRIS facility, but it's basically a convening and coordinating group for the whole sector, which is funded by government, and subsequently to get very significant investment in big telescopes, the Square Kilometre Array and the precursors, for instance, and some of the supercomputing facilities that support those. So billions of dollars of new investments in astronomy research as a consequence of this decision by the community to get together with a united voice and go out with a single message rather than being divided and being disconnected from each other. And everyone's been trying to replicate that ever since. With various levels of success. Some have been more successful than others. Not every discipline has managed to secure billions of dollars of investment, as you are well aware. But there have been some of these plans which have actually leveraged quite significant policy announcements, but also which have provided the basis for things like successful Centre of Excellence applications or CRC bids. And in all cases, these decadal plans, when they're developed and endorsed by a research community, whether or not it's fully representative or just a selective component of that community, people are able to then go along with these and link their proposals and their ideas to the plan. So, you know, we do hear from our colleagues at the ARC and the NHMRC that when they have an application for funding that comes in and says this project is directly aligned with priority 3.2A of the decadal plan for discipline X, it carries some weight because these decadal plans now are recognised to kind of represent a more or less consensus view of the research sector about where the most important issues lie and where the most valuable investments could be made. So towards a decadal plan for Australian educational research, that was basically the consensus at the end of the day in Melbourne. People agreed that there are lots of problems. We need to do something together to change the status quo. And the way we agreed to do it collectively is to work together to develop a decadal plan for Australian educational research. So what's in a plan? Starts off, we need a vision. So in this case, this will be wordsmithed in due course, but a vision for world-class, impactful and connected Australian education research. We need a strong business case. Needs to be a case for how will society benefit from investment or prioritisation of some of these issues. And there needs to be a very clear action framework. So there needs to be goals, priority actions, delivery models, responsibilities, and measurable outputs. So it kind of needs to be structured, very structured, so that people can kind of pick it up and look at it and say, oh, okay, well, the community has agreed that we need to address this challenge by investing in this particular program, this kind of particular initiative, setting up this particular model, and these are the outcomes we can expect. And then last, but perhaps most importantly, it needs to have an implementation kind of framework around it as well. So, as we all know, producing a report is one thing, but if we stop there and deliver the report to our policy colleagues, we can't really expect them to kind of say, oh, well, thank you very much, we'll act on this now. It needs to be kind of actively pushed. Otherwise, these things just end up on shelves gathering dust or in the physical or the virtual bin. So developing a plan, but also having an organised approach to ensuring its implementation and monitoring its implementation. And that was where we got to. Why develop a decadal plan? Again, I've talked about this a little, but one of the reasons it actually does provide an opportunity for the sector to develop a deeper understanding of the composition of the education research field and its connections across educational policy and practice. I'm well aware that much of this work is probably ongoing or being done in different ways already, but just quantifying the amount of money that is invested in educational research across the board, from federal government, from states and territories, from philanthropic organisations, from agencies. I think that would be useful and new information. Looking at some comparisons between disciplines in Australia, but also international comparisons. And then looking at some of the formal and the informal mechanisms for connecting educational research with practice in an evaluative way, which kind of tries to assess how well they're working or not. These things really do provide a good opportunity to mobilise the research community and research stakeholders around that common vision. So it's not just the researchers either, it's also the peak bodies, it's also the provider organisations, it's the unions, it's the teachers associations, it's the people who are both doing the research but also benefiting directly from the research or in need of good research, who can really come together around this to kind of build some excitement even and enthusiasm about what can be achieved. Obviously, I mean, a plan's not a plan unless it's got some clear strategic priorities. And part of a prioritisation process as well, importantly, involves deciding what's not a priority. It's not just what are the priorities, it's also what aren't the priorities. That's sometimes the harder part, but a good, solid plan needs to say we need to invest in X, Y, Z priority, and these other things are important, but not at the same level, and perhaps things that can be put to the side or picked up later on as funds or resources become available. Importantly as well, that those priorities need to cover the whole field. So it's not just priorities for government, it's not just our research sector going to government saying, this is our strategic plan and these are the things you need to invest in to let us deliver it. It needs to be priorities as well for the sector. So for universities, for institutions, for state governments, for various educational agencies. So devolved responsibility. Obviously, federal and state and territory governments are a big player. They're the primary source of funding and resources, but what can the rest of the sector do as well to kind of help this along? Just the fact of doing this kind of exercise, even the roundtable in Melbourne, helps to increase the profile and the standing of the field. Obviously, I mean, it's intuitive. Everyone will kind of understand that education research takes place in Australian universities and Australian research councils and the like. But it doesn't have much visibility when it's connected and just lots of different groups and individuals doing their own things. So by coming together and putting things out like the communique that we published, like a decadal plan, we get to the point of having a decadal plan if we can launch it at Parliament House and get the Education Minister and the opposition spokesperson to speak to it. It's automatically elevated the visibility of education research and gets people thinking about where are the potential for benefit. Excuse me, just one sec. And then again, as I said, it provides that pathway for sector-wide implementation and collaboration over the coming decade. So subsequent to the roundtable in August, we've been doing a little bit more work with the kind of organising group, but also with in discussion with some of the people who are involved and some of the organisations who are represented. So what we're proposing to try and do is to pool funding and resources and explore other funding opportunities to be able to do this planning process properly. One of the learnings from all of the other disciplines that have done this before is that if you try and do it on goodwill and volunteer time, it doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't happen effectively. It needs dedicated resourcing. It needs people who have got a focus on actually producing the work. Obviously, also it needs to draw heavily on voluntary contributions and inputs from the sector. But unless there's kind of a person driving the consultation processes, driving the drafting, etc., it may not happen. We've got an example from another group trying to develop a decadal plan for parenting and family research in Australia. And our Academy of Social Sciences supported them with a small grant in 2020. And the thinking there from that sector was that they could use that small grant and to convene a couple of meetings, but basically to do all of the work on voluntary contributions. We're almost 5 years later and halfway through the decade, and there's no decadal plan. So without resourcing, it's not going to happen. And we need, without going to government, we basically need to pass the hat around to stakeholder organisations to see if we can pool some resources to appoint people. We'll establish a steering committee comprising those people who are able to contribute financially or significantly in kind. We'll appoint or task project staff, and this isn't just employing kind of necessarily, policy officers or research assistants. We do have opportunities in this kind of process to basically bring in PhD students, for instance, as policy interns. So through government schemes, but also through, funding that might be available through this program to ask around the sector and various partners for nominations of bright and enthusiastic PhD students or recent graduates or master's students, for example, who would actually like to have a significant role in this process as part of a policy learning experience, and getting some people in who can actually contribute to that process, organise and control the consultation process, engage with government departments. By the time we get to the launch, actually go along to Parliament House and be in the room with the minister and the opposition minister talking about this kind of stuff. It's a really valuable learning experience for students as an internship, and it's it's a really valuable way to get some energy and enthusiasm and expertise into a project without necessarily having to employ people. And obviously, just to make sure it's a dedicated project, we put together a website so that we can share information and inform the community what's going on. From there, it's basically a consultation process, which following a well-trodden path of these other ones, but we put together a discussion paper, which would be based on a kind of a stock take of the structure and composition of Australian education research at the moment. And we'd have a series of questions that we'd ask people. And people would have an opportunity to answer those questions through written submissions, through roundtables, virtual, maybe physical, and targeted interviews as well. So basically information collection. When all of that info would come in and we'd synthesize it, then the steering committee would really be working to try and pass it and come to consensus on the structure and priorities of a decadal plan. And depending on where we're going and how much time we had, there might be further opportunities for kind of, a green paper style approach where we'd share that back out with the community as a draft, a penultimate draft before we launch it. And then the launch and the implementation. So, Canberra, ideally at Parliament House, depending on where we are in the election and or policy cycles, and having all of the key stakeholders along. So not just the minister and the opposition minister, but federal and state education bureaucrats, key decision makers from government, but also from the sector, so people can actually see this and understand it during a brief window of time and kind of be primed for follow-up on what needs to happen next. And that's the post-launch implementation and kind of group process. Very broadly, this is our kind of thinking of what happens through those various stages. So establishing the project over the next couple of months, ideally before Christmas. Then we'd set up working on a discussion paper, consulting with the sector kind of March to May-ish next year. Pulling together a plan, in the middle and second half of the year, and then launching towards the end of next year. It's obviously subject to being able to raise some funding and get cracking. It's always a harder process than you think, and it's, as much as anything, it's because of time commitments of people, but we're still hopeful. We've had some positive engagement with some of the organisations at the table, and we're kind of on track to start raising enough funds so that we can formally commence this process. And that's roughly what we're looking at. So it needs funding, but it's not a lot of funding, or maybe it is a lot of funding in this sector, but in comparison to the amount of money that would be spent on these processes in government or in the private sector, we're talking about a kind of pool of about $60,000, which will get us a part-time project officer or some seconded policy interns. And we try and leverage or match that. There's some thinking about potentially going to philanthropic organisations or trusts and foundations. If the sector can pull together about 60 grand, then we'd try and match that or double it through philanthropic or other contributions to be able to do this in a more comfortable way. That's basically what we're thinking. I think I've just got one more slide here before I kind of stop and open for questions. And this is really, it's a diversion from the roundtable. It's a diversion from a decadal plan for education research, but it's really about the value of the organisations who are doing this kind of thing having skin in the game. So what I wanted to talk about very briefly is a new program from the Academy of the Social Sciences. I flagged it at the beginning of my talk, which is around development and distribution of high quality evidence-based curriculum resources in the social science subject areas for Australian schools. And I've got a little video here. Hopefully this will
We aren't able to hear it through Teams though.
Sorry, you're not able to hear?
No, so I feel like there's an option, or even if you send me the link, I can send the video through to everyone after.
I'll just I'll see if I can reshare.
Kelsey, you can if you just hit when you share sound.
I'll try and do that.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, Chris is just redoing that now.
I believe the social sciences are really ways of observing the world so that we can then make the world a better place.
It starts with our kids and a vision from the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia.
To try to understand those fundamental questions about who we are.
We connect the shared knowledge of more than 700 leading researchers and experts direct to the classroom with high quality resources.
Teachers are needing quality social science resources to support teaching and learning in Australian schools.
The Seriously Social School Program.
How much water have you drunk today?
With themed modules of learning experiences, teacher guidance and videos.
The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Australia can be described as like a birth certificate of a nation.
Real world topics, peer reviewed by Australia's leading social scientists.
Certainly in schools, teachers are burdened with all sorts of expectations and need support.
So let's empower the kids of today with the tools they need for tomorrow.
The Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia.
Commonwealth of Australia.
All right, so again, that's the promo thing. That's the funding pitch to government and others to try and secure some investment in this program. It has been a kind of an internal investment from the Academy. It was a strategic priority for our board, so we've spent almost $250,000 getting to the stage we're at now with some pilot resources that are starting to be used in Australian schools, and we're looking now to try and kind of leverage and expand that and turn it into a sustainable program. But in the context of a broader focus on educational research, it's these kinds of things, and it's not just our Academy, it'll be many of our other partners as well, which are kind of demonstrating the tangible application of research evidence into practice in a way that creates beneficial outcomes. So I just wanted to share that. There's more information on the website. Happy to send it through afterwards. And again, this is a new program, but we're very much looking forward to engaging with the research community around it as we roll out as well.
Yes, thanks very much, Chris. Thanks for sharing that resource, for the presentation, and for the overview of the work of the Academy. I have one question to start with, then we'll go to those in the chat and open to the floor. The harrowing data that you shared earlier on that compared investment into education research compared to health was it certainly provided a striking context for your presentation today. Do you think that the decadal plan initiative has the elements that would be necessary to impact on that ratio, at least in Australia?
Yeah, I think it really does, Steve. I mean, I don't have the background and the history that some people here will have, but I imagine that relatively lack of funding has basically come about through neglect and inattention from the decision makers. most of the funding is probably competitive grants through the ARC, and we all know from other disciplines as well that unless there are special research initiatives put forward or, special kind of funding announcements, the standard grants process is kind of chicken and egg, right? So the successful fields get more grants, they build their capacity, they put in more applications, they get more grants, and those smaller fields, they kind of naturally wither because there isn't as much capacity to put in applications and there's not as many people doing so in subsequent rounds. So I suspect it's probably that kind of process of years of I'm sure there's exceptions and there's been some wonderful centres and different things come through, but I imagine over time it's just been that kind of neglect. And it's this kind of process where people get organised and come together and actually start making the case and getting the attention of, of the decision makers and the regulators and the policy makers, which can start to turn things around. And that, educational attainment is front of mind for a lot of policymakers and educational disadvantage. So these kinds of statistics, and there'll be more as well, can really help to paint the picture of why more attention is needed on the kind of on the evidence to inform the solutions, and just those kinds of comparisons can be quite striking. Asking for funding's sake, and simply going to government and saying, education research is underfunded compared to health and medical research. It needs to be fixed. That'll never work. It's not effective. It always has to be outcomes focused and solutions focused, and what is the return on investment of this money to the Australian taxpayers, which is ultimately where the money is coming from.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm just looking now at the chat and just going through in order. We have a question from Mingyan Hu, who's online. Did the roundtable mention any priorities in promoting and supporting language learning and teaching in schools?
It didn't. We didn't get down to that kind of discipline-specific level. Having said that, we have, as an academy, we've worked with academies in other countries a couple of years back now. We put out a statement on the importance of language education in schooling. I'll try and dig that up and pop it in the chat. That's the kind of thing I'm sure that a decadal plan could get to, as when we start that consultation and start to kind of look into the priority areas and the extent to which research can help to inform the better or the more effective or the more widely taken up teaching and learning of languages in schools. But we certainly didn't get to it in the course of that day.
Yes, okay. There's a question here, Chris, from one of our PhD students who is wondering how they can contribute to this kind of work.
Well, thank you. So there's a couple of ways. As we get going, and I'm hopeful we'll have the opportunity to provide these kind of opportunities for opportunities for policy internships. So we've done that very effectively in the past, and we might have some constraints on who's applying based on preference to the parties and the institutions that are putting in funding. But that would be one thing. I can imagine we'd have 2 or maybe 3 PhD students as policy interns who'd come in and actually do a significant part of the work on this over the course of 3 months or so, as a leave of absence from their PhD or as a kind of institutionally authorised internship program. And then the other way, of course, is through the consultation process when we get to that point. So we'll be looking for input from as many and as broad-reaching kind of parts of the community as we can. And as I said, there's likely to be an opportunity for written submissions, contribution through roundtables where we'll kind of seek people's views and potentially one-on-one interviews as well.
Thanks, Chris. We have a couple of questions from Jason. Jason, would you like to turn your sound on and just talk us through those questions?
Stephen, sorry, it's Paolo here.
Yes.
Mine kind of connects with Jason's, and I've just got to run to a meeting, and I'm a bit pushy, so sorry. Can't even see me properly.
You go
Jason, Jason, do you mind if I just jump in?
Go ahead.
I've been doing a fair bit of homework on different digital platforms because teachers are increasingly saying they're using, when I've done research, they're using anything from Teachers Pay Teachers to Twinkle to Raz Plus to, I can seriously count about 10 different platforms. Some of these platforms have got millions of users. Teachers Pay Teachers have got millions of users. Now, what is the Academy doing that's going to be any different from that? And a number of those platforms now are quite clever, and what they've got is an AI, assistant underpinning a lot of those resources. So what they underpinning the platform. So for example, when I've trialed some of those platforms, they're seriously brilliant. I might use some of those resources and then I think, oh, I need to modify this slightly. It gets modified within literally hours, and it uses that feedback through the artificial intelligence to generate other resources. So my curiosity is, what is the Academy presenting or offering that is going to be able to compete with what's already out there? And yes, I can hear the Australian voice, but I don't know what it is that's going to be particularly different. Sorry, that was a big ramble.
No, thanks, Paula. That's great. So I guess first and foremost, these resources are going to be free, so people won't have to pay for them. They won't have to register to download them. They're going to be peer reviewed, so they'll have kind of a stamp of authority of an academy on them. And they're not lesson plans. I think that's one of the kind of key principles we've been advised from our community, is that kind of prescribed lesson plan, that direct instruction kind of approach is not consistent with the evidence. What we want instead is a kind of scaffolded sequence of learning experiences that teachers can use and apply as they see fit in their own classrooms. So yes, it's not going to be as dynamic and probably not as pick up and play as some of those other offerings. But what we're kind of leaning back on is the idea that they're freely available, that they're peer reviewed, and that they come from a kind of an evidence-based organisation. The other thing is we're looking at partnerships. So Scoodle is the government provider will have everything listed there. We've got a partnership with a group called ClickView, which is a kind of educational video resource provider. But things like Twinkle and some of those others, we've looked at and been advised to steer clear.
Thanks, Chris. Jason, can we go back to your questions?
Yeah, hi, Chris. I just had two. One, in terms of the decadal plan, it looks firstly quite insular. It's not looking to provide international leadership or even regional leadership. Was that intended?
Well, the discussion at the time was the need for challenges and opportunities for Australian educational research. Obviously, in order to be world-class and connected, that was the third priority. It's going to be vital to be internationally connected as well, but I suspect there's not, well, we might be wrong, this might come through in the consultations, but my instinct is this will be a plan for Australia, an Australian research community reaching out to the international community and being better connected, but not international in scope in its own right.
The other question I had is, particularly when it's bookending with a strong social justice agenda around Indigenous issues at the start, and then at the end, it looks at AI, but the AI is only looked at in terms of a tool that can be used and exploited. Nothing about where AI may go to in terms of autonomous AI and how that will affect society and how society will affect AI development. So it just seems to be framing AI as a tool rather than potentially part of society. And given the Academy's framing, it would seem to be that should be something that the Academy should be looking at in terms of what may occur at the end of the decadal plan or further into it.
Thanks, Jason. It's a really good point, and there was some. We only had a few hours for discussion in Melbourne, so and this summary again is kind of a selective presentation of some of that discussion. There was a fair bit of discussion about AI, both as a teaching technology, but also, I mean, I can't quite remember the discussion now. Steve, you might have a better recollection, but AI is more than a technology in education, but as kind of AI-informed pedagogy, which is perhaps getting partly to what you're talking about. But, you know, the broader issues of, you know, how is education going to be delivered in 10 years in a radically transformed kind of social landscape with AI integrated into most of what we do? That's, you know, I'm sure it's something we'll try and grapple with. How successfully, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Chris. Thanks very much, Jason. I'm just looking at the chat further. One of the folks on the line, Chris Bigham, points out that one of our colleagues in South Australia, Lester Rigney, went on the ARC panel of experts. He reckoned that the most fierce criticism of bids in education was orders of magnitude higher than in other social sciences. Do you suppose perhaps that research educators, their self-criticism contributes to the situation that the plan's attempting to address?
Well, I mean, obviously I can't say for sure, and it's possibly a question of chicken and egg as well. There is that famous quote about the competition in academia being so fierce because the pickings are so small, and if the pickings are orders of magnitude smaller again in education research, maybe the competition is equally more savage. But whether that's a consequence of the limited resources or a kind of a cause or somewhere in between, who knows? But certainly, you know, in the context of a decadal plan, the first and most important outcome of the process is that we try and lift people out of that competitive frame and get people to think collaboratively about the future. You know, obviously people are still going to be competing for grants regardless of how much funding is in the system, but at least for the purpose of planning ahead to the future and thinking about the outcomes and the vision, getting people to put aside those differences and really try and work collaboratively and imagine reimagine what the system could look like and how it could produce more and better outcomes.
Yeah, okay. Well, really connected to that point, Chris, is a comment of Judy Rose. You mentioned that some of the decadal plans involved interdisciplinary teams. Does education research need to be more cross-disciplinary to attract better funding and perhaps produce stronger outcomes?
Thank you, and that is a good question. I mean, one of the points of discussion at the roundtable in Melbourne is whether education is a discipline or a field. I'd never really thought about the differences between the terms there, but I think the consensus was that it's less disciplinary and more field-like, in that it does actually, you know, at least in the current, you know, context, involve people from a broad range of disciplines who are coming together to look at educational issues, whether they're economists or sociologists or anthropologists or, you know, straight education academics. There is already quite a lot of interdisciplinarity in the education research field, and that is certainly what we kind of decided on in Melbourne as the framing is education research as a field. But again, it's a good question. I mean, this is something that the social sciences more generally grapple with as well. You know, we have lots of people who we nominally count as social scientists who wouldn't necessarily think of themselves first and foremost as social scientists. You know, so accounting, business, economics, academics, for instance, we include them, but they probably don't think of themselves as being part of the whole. And that maybe that's similar in the education field. There are lots of people who are interested in and looking at education at different points in the lifespan who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves to be education academics. So yeah, part of the process it'll be, I guess, in the consultations.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Thanks very much, Judy. And there's an observation here by Rebecca Baker. What we want as school leaders is to know that the resources our teachers are accessing are quality assured and curriculum linked. We don't have this guarantee with platforms like Twinkle. So I suppose that's support in a way, Chris, for the kinds of resources that AWSA is producing.
Well, yeah, thank you. And looking to produce. I mean, as I said, we've developed a pilot set of pilot resources. There's 3 modules there, one on respectable civil discourse, one on water as part of the geography curriculum, and then a cross-curriculum module on debating as a classroom methodology. But they're all absolutely curriculum linked, and from page 1 on, we've got the experts listed, the people who contributed. What we're trying to do is get that kind of government funding so that we can not only produce more of these, but also get them out to every school in hard copy and promotional material. And we're following in the footsteps of some of the other STEM academies here. So the Australian Academy of Science for decades, in fact, has been delivering primary connections in science by doing some. I'm not sure people here are probably aware of those programs, but similar model. It's kind of quality assured, curriculum linked, freely available resources which are produced by an academy and have that kind of quality assurance stamp. And that's something that we kind of bring to the table, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I have a final question, and then we might perhaps ask people online whether they've got any last questions. But the question I have is, Chris, I noticed that the Academy had published a research infrastructure decadal plan, connected, innovative and responsive. What would you say are the implications for education research coming out of that decadal plan?
Thanks, Steve. And it's a good question. So I think I touched on it in the under priority 3 from the roundtable, and it's really around that kind of data infrastructure and the ability for researchers to access high quality data, to link that data to other data sets, and all of the things that go around that, the kind of the human infrastructure that's required for data analysis, the kind of computer science expertise which is required to maintain some of the platforms which deliver these services, analysis in the cloud kind of things which can be set up to respect privacy and confidentiality, secure data labs as well for sensitive data. And that's, I imagine, probably a particular issue in education where you're dealing with minors and children. So there's a lot there. It kind of, we weren't focused on any one discipline in that decadal plan, but certainly some of the things that came up in the consultation were the challenges associated with accessing national educational kind of data, student data, early childhood data, the cross-jurisdictional things, but also the challenges of getting permissions and pulling things and the inconsistent approaches to collection, standardization, the need for better metadata, etc. So all of those kinds of things will, I'm sure, come into play. They're all issues and priorities for the implementation group that's being set up around that infrastructure decadal plan. And hopefully there'll be some short and medium term benefits that will assist the education research community as well coming out of that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that many people on this call will understand some of those issues and appreciate that work by the Academy. Any other questions from people here today? Well, okay. Chris, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today to talk us through the Education Research Decadal Plan. There are some really exciting next steps, so we'll be keeping a close watch on how this unfolds. It's certainly exciting and new work. Yeah, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Kelsey, for the invitation. And yeah, hopefully there'll be an opportunity to work very closely with the Institute and colleagues here on the development of that plan. We'll send the invoice for the check shortly, Steve, and get going from there.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. You have a good day. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.